Hi, my name is Sahirah and welcome to the Godot community. I am the virtual PLC lead for high school 2D art. Welcome to webinar topic 2. In today's webinar, we'll discuss my classroom setup. I'll share some of my favorite lessons and activities, and I'll also share tried and true strategies that have worked for me throughout my 13 years of teaching. So here you can see a view from my desk of my classroom. I like to ensure that everything is accessible for students. However, with the pandemic, a lot of things have been labeled for teacher access only. So you can see the desks are as distant as possible with no more than 2 per table. There is some storage space for pallets in the back of the classroom. There is storage space for some bins in the back of the classroom as well. Well, that's right behind that trash can there. That's actually a double-sided shelf. So on one side, there are bins that students can check out. And what I'll do is sanitize them before they take them and after they bring them back, of course. And on the opposite side, there is room for student sketchbooks that they need to, in case they want to leave it in the classroom. However, I do encourage students to take their sketchbooks and work with them each day. There are 3 art desks in the back of the classroom as well that are right along the wall. If students want to stand up and work, or if they just want to work by themselves, I encourage students to work back there in that area. There are 2 sinks in my classroom as well, and then right to the right of my classroom is my storage area. I do try to keep the paper cutter in any classroom that I've been in. It's always been at the front of the classroom near me so I can make sure that it's safe. So behind the desk, you'll see my laptop there, and the district just provided some larger computer screens that we can use as well as the document cameras on my desk as well. So behind me, you can see the board, and I'll project any kind of demos and things like that there onto that large board. And then you can see the door that leads to the storage area in a little bit. On the right side of the screen is an office, and then through that door is a cool feature that I think the school has, is we use it as a portfolio storage. So you can see, the room is set up so that it's accessible, trying to keep as much space in between students. I usually have no more than around between 9 and 12 students in my classroom. So I also have 2 drying racks. This is the larger drying rack that students can use, of course, to store any kind of wet work. And what I'll do is I try to allot like the bottom half to, a certain period, the top to another period, so that way you can see the space in between the 2 areas. And of course, this is the drying rack where they can just kind of slide in and slide out. They don't really have to lift up necessarily. On the next screen, you can see the portfolio storage, which during normal conditions, one of these would be for each class. So what I do now is I leave portfolios here that students can actually check out if they need it per period, so they no longer store their work in the classroom. However, a lot of students some students do have their own portfolios, but in the cases when we work a little bit larger, some students might want to check out a portfolio. And of course, those are sanitized before a student takes them and after a student takes them. And these portfolio organizers, I would definitely recommend. It just allows students to keep everything organized, and also allows you as the teacher to access work as needed. Of course, that's during regular working conditions. On the wall, I try to keep the elements and principles of design displayed, just for like when we're having critiques, and encouraging students to use their art vocabulary, that is easily accessible. And then there's another board on this side of the classroom as well that I usually use for AP students. So it could be things like deadlines or just reminders, but they know that's their board to go to for any kind of notes from me. And this is actually, so if I'm looking out into my classroom, this is to the left of my classroom. What I did is store things like tape, things like, what else is in here? Office supplies. So like paper clips, rubber bands, my dry erase markers are on this cabinet, kind of anything I would need that won't all fit in my desk. So that's essentially my kind of extra space. And students don't usually go over there into this area without asking. And of course, during the pandemic, they usually don't go over there at all. So in that brown cabinet is where I store all the paper for different students. And if you can see, if you look a little closely, there's a sign posted to where, like, if I'm out, they know not to go in there, but they can email me with questions about, getting into the cabinet. So, for example, if I'm out of the building, they might email me and I can ask one of the other teachers if they can get the materials for them out of that cabinet. So one thing I started last year was assigning students old Prismacolor color pencil palettes, just because when I moved into the room, or when I got this job at the school, there were a lot of Prismacolor palettes. So of course she had regular palettes and the larger painter palettes that she usually used with the palette paper. But Prismacolor color pencil boxes actually work really good to store paint. As long as the lid is on really tight, it works just the same in terms of keeping the paint from drying out as any other palette would. So I would highly recommend keeping the Prismacolor boxes along with the bins that some drawing pencils come in. Any kind of metal container can be used really successfully. Another thing is keeping all the paintbrushes, or assigning paintbrushes to a student for the whole semester, in which they get a grade for check-ins in terms of keeping the brush clean, keeping paint out of the brush, just studio practices, and all that goes into their grade. And it was very successful last year in terms of not having a bunch of paintbrushes at the end of the year that you had to either clean out, or they were just too terrible to be able to revive that you had to throw away. So I would definitely recommend assigning students palettes. And so in terms of the classroom, those brown shelves that were in the back of the room, there's an area designated for each class, so they know to, keep their palette in a certain area. It really helps with just accountability and students being able to come in and easily access their materials. And the shelves I mentioned before, where they can store or check out these containers. So if we're working with materials where they might be doing mixed media, or especially some of my AP kids where they might have magazines, or, I had a couple students one year incorporate wire, but more than they might want to just dump in their book bag, they might check out one of these to-go storage containers. And of course, it's cleaned out, sanitized, and restored back there when they're done. So in terms of favorite lessons and activities, I'll spend a few slides talking about a couple of my favorite lessons. This lesson is one that was done in an introductory to art class. So we started with doing different mini labs revolving around blind contour and modified contour drawings. So we pulled out several plants and foliage that was in the storage closet, and students were able to pick what objects they wanted to draw. Students that might work from home, they can actually go outside and draw, or, if it's winter or too cold, they can, as a last resort, look up images on their phone. So we did several mini labs revolving around blind and modified contour drawings using a permanent marker. Of course, we talked about line variation and where to kind of emphasize different lines. So that was the kind of a cool activity that they enjoyed. The next step was a mini lab revolving around color theory. So they got to experiment with different color combinations. With this project, it was more so focused on complementary colors. So they were able to experiment with the placement of those colors in their drawings that they did. And of course, they usually started with a favorite color and kind of, went from there in terms of choosing their color scheme. The next step of this project was to look at plant cells under a microscope. So if you're not friends with your science teacher or science teachers, definitely make friends with those because they have some really cool stuff in their rooms that could be used for drawing projects. And of course, you can look up some images online and print them out for them. But plant cells under a microscope, they looked at the different cell walls and things like that. And some of them actually did start conversations, that might have taken place in their particular science class. So it's kind of cool to hear those little sidebar conversations. So they experimented with drawing those. So of course, after the practice with the blind modified contour drawings, they were actually able to get their final paper. And in their practice drawing, they experimented with the color scheme. Once they were happy or pleased, they placed the colors on their final sheet of paper. The next step was to draw in some of the negative spaces, the plant cells under a microscope. So they're activating some of the negative space, trying to break it up into larger or smaller spaces. And then they went in with value, different lines, added contrast, and even more color to create these compositions. So we felt that these were very successful for an intro to art class. And the students, actually, a lot of them, I think a lot of times you can tell the success in a project by the amount of projects that are taken home by students, and this was one of those. Another favorite lesson that I like to do with my drawing and painting one class are these texture spheres, and y'all have probably seen this lesson out and about on the internet, but I feel that students are very successful with, especially the students that like to doodle and don't mind, experimenting with different mark making techniques, which usually is going to be your drawing and painting students. They're very pleased and will work diligently to make these really look good. So what we did was start with different line and mark making techniques, so stipple, scribble, cross hatching, so on and so forth. They did various value scales. They did then experimented with creating form on different shapes, or creating forms with different shapes, using those different line techniques or mark making techniques. So all that practice was then applied to experimenting with different compositions in their sketchbook. So once they were pleased with the composition, of course, they transferred that to a larger sheet of paper. And then they were to come up with their own background. So a lot of them used, like on the right, you can see she used actually chalk pastel. The student on the left used just Sharpie. But I had some students use watercolor. So I left that very open-ended for students to be able to choose their background. You can see some of the mini labs that we did in terms of just applying the textures to spheres. And of course, this all took place before the final. Another one of my favorite lessons or activities I've done especially during the pandemic, is this value lesson. I did it with an introductory class, and so first they started with a value scale, and we're just using regular number 2 pencils. If you're face-to-face, of course, you can use some of the drawing pencils. But they start with the value scale, starting with the lightest, working their way to the darkest. And then they work drawing 3 forms. And of course, you talk about, highlight, shadow, midtone, all that kind of stuff. So they get the practice, applying the medium or the values to the forms using that same number 2 pencil. And then they go into composition practice. So they create 3 different ideas in terms of how they will create this idea of layering. So it's supposed to look like, cells or, some kind of organic matter stacked, in this weird space. So the further away they go, um, they might be a little more muted. The closer up they are, they should be a little more detailed. Um, so the first thing they do is start with just spacing out or creating these organic shapes, which will be like the openings. And then you'll see all the shapes overlapping in those open spaces. So I felt like students were very successful with this particular project, especially once they got the idea of layering and making it look like things are stacking on top of each other. So if you start with what's furthest away first, and then stack on top, you'll be more successful in that way. Another lesson that I really enjoyed doing, and students really enjoy drawing themselves. So if are a teacher, you know that students love drawing or looking at themselves. Um, so this was a really successful lesson, another painting lesson. So they start with drawing eyes, mouths, nose, ears, all the facial features. Then, of course, they put them together. This was an upper level drawing and painting class. Just using color pencils, trying to deter using just um, like a peach or a brown straight out the box, but encouraging mixing colors to create the skin tones. So I kind of took away like, the blacks and browns and, any kind of skin tones and encouraged them to just work with creating their skin tones. So direct observation, they're working from a mirror or, a photograph in some cases. So they do various experimentations with facial features, and then they move on into creating skin tones using just the primary colors plus white. So again, I've taken away any black, any brown, anything that looks like a skin tone. They were, pretty successful in terms of creating highlights, midtones, undertones, just using the primary colors. And they did take photographs and I printed them out. And of course, there are different apps that you can use in terms of for the next step. So they did create a grid, and they're doing two different versions. So this particular lesson I enjoy because it encourages them to paint with the painting style they might not normally use. So, whereas you have students that might be really interested in creating something realistic, it deters them from or encourages them to experiment with a different painting style. So here a student is gridding her photograph, and of course the student on the left is mixing her paint, and the student on the right is creating these different spaces in which she'll break up shadows and highlights. So on the left, and I'm allowing them to kind of experiment with the style as they want to. On the next screen, you'll see a little bit more about what I mean. So she has she drew the facial features, of course, and this appears a little more flat in some areas, but she is breaking up the different highlights and shadows in order to, create the face. And of course, this renders or reads a little more flat, but the color experimentation is there. The experimentation is there, so I was very pleased with the results. And then on the left, a similar approach, except she's breaking the spaces up into smaller sections. So in terms of the highlights, shadows, she has a smaller brush, and she's really gone in and broken up some of those areas, leaving the paint brushes or leaving the paint stroke, obvious in a lot of the painting. So again, this is a really good lesson for encouraging students to experiment with other painting styles, and also encouraging them to really mix and create their own skin tones and just colors in general. It discourages using paint straight out the tube. So another thing I wanted to talk about were tried and true strategies that work and that have worked. So I think a simple question as students come in, how are you? How was your day? How is your day going? How was your weekend? If they shared something with you that previous week, following up with, what they spoke about. So if they got a new job, or if they just had a really, bad day, or maybe they weren't feeling well, or maybe they had just a really exciting moment. But just following up, I think, is really important. Students really want to know that you care. And I think they'll really enjoy coming to the class, more. A lot of students say that, oh, I just love being in here, or I love coming to this class. It's such like a de-stressor. I really appreciate, you following up with things that I told you about. So hearing those comments from students, I think, is really important to me. Showcasing student growth and talent, I think, is really, really important. So whenever I hear about an opportunity to display student work, I try to jump at it. So in the middle is actually me, and I took my two kids with me. There was an exhibit at the High Museum for students, so I was able to display some student work there. And then my kids were able to see, kind of the behind the scenes of, hanging student work. So they were actually helpers for the day. But students were, it was made a big deal. They were given invitations to the event. They took their families once everything was hung up and ready for them to see. But showcasing student work in the hallway is really big, even if it's shouting out a student, oh, you did a really good job. Oh, I can see your growth. Did you look at where you started and where you are now? This is awesome. But just showing that excitement for a student is really important in terms of letting them know that you see their progress. Field trips, I feel, are another really, really important activity. It allows connections to be built within the community. We've done field trips in the past, pre-pandemic, to artist studios. So students were able to get contact information, share portfolios, get feedback about their work. Some were actually able to get internships. One year we did a art show that was in collaboration with a food bank. So I think field trips, I can't say enough about field trips. It gives students a day out in the community. A lot of times you'll teach students that haven't been anywhere, they haven't been far away from their school or where they live. So sometimes overnight field trips might be a good idea, or even just a day trip, where you leave before school starts and you get back when school ends. So really important part of, I think, building an art student is allowing them to see the, art beyond the walls of their community. Student responsibility and accountability is definitely something that's very important to me, just because, accountability, it's a part of life. It's a part of growing up. You can't go anywhere and not be accountable for your actions. So I think students learning that in the classroom, or just, whatever age they are, will stick with them as they go throughout life. So, if they have a mess, or if they made a mess, making sure that they clean it up, or if they weren't honest about something, making sure that, they are aware that that they weren't honest. You can do it in a respectful way, but I think, just bringing it up or not ignoring it is definitely important. A lot of times I will, especially during this virtual environment, I'll email students and I'll CC their parent, just to let the parent know that, oh, this issue is a concern, or I've asked the student in class and they haven't responded, but allowing them to see that, you are building a relationship, or connection, or just open communication with their parent in a way that they can be held accountable by their family, is important as well. So I hope that you have enjoyed this webinar, and I hope that you will join me for the next one. Thank you so much for joining me. Again, my name is Sahirah Dean, Have a great evening.